Have you ever wondered what, exactly, a story is? Why do we tell them? What do they do for us? And how did they come about in the first place? Nathan B. Weller is a story consultant and content strategist by trade, a humanist by conviction, and an artist by default. He's also a writer, bookworm, movie junkie, and storyteller, drinker of coffee, tea, and whiskey, rider of bikes and destroyer of pizza. Nathan Weller will share his thoughts on how to lead an enriched life through a deeper understanding of stories. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Nathan Weller.
Thanks, guys. Let me get set up here. Oh. I don't think I have enough screens.
You also need to read the
in your...
Yeah.
And I need to log you in.
Yep.
Don't worry, I'll edit this out.
Let's keep it.
Nope.
I'm better off behind the camera. Cool. There we go. How's everybody doing?
Good.
All right, so my talk today is called Your Life on Stories. What are stories? Where do stories come from? Why do we tell stories? In my opinion, these are three of the most profound questions that we can ask ourselves as human beings, and I'll tell you why in a bit. Most people actually go their entire lives completely inundated with stories from every angle. As the intro said, and as I'm about ready to repeat, we get them all over the place. They're how we recount the events of our day. It's how we get our news. It's how we teach history. It's how we teach anything, really. It's how we share comedy, grow and build community. Stories are literally everywhere and a part of everything that we do. Stories are a strange and compelling mystery of human life, one so prevalent it might never occur to us to question where they come from or why we tell them. But for those of us who do, I believe that the rewards are immeasurable. And so I'd like to dive in and answer each one of these questions in turn. Why do we tell stories? Anyone want to take a stab? Or sorry, what are stories, rather? Anyone want to take a stab? No one. All right. Well, I mean, I think most of us probably grew up getting a really bad definition of stories in grade school. A story is something with a beginning, middle, and an end. It always bothered me. Hate that description. It doesn't say anything unique about what a story actually is. There are so many other things in life that have a beginning, middle, and an end. You know, a nap, a manufacturing process, most romantic relationships. They all have beginning, middle, and end, but nothing unique there about stories. So I actually had to turn to some dictionaries for some help, and the first one I did is the Oxford English Dictionary. And let's see what it has to say. Oh, I'm having some trouble here. The Oxford English Dictionary says, an account of imaginary or real people and events told for entertainment. And I think that's obviously better than the first one, but it's still, for me at least, leaves something to be desired. So I looked up another dictionary, and this is the Merriam-Webster, and it says, an account of incidents or events. And I think, even though it's shorter and simpler, I think it actually gets a lot closer to what a story is, because stories don't have to be told for entertainment. We already talked about how they can be told for news. But I think the best definition I found for stories so far was in a book that I have here with me today called The 7 Basic Plots. And it's by Christopher Booker. And he's a scholar on stories and what stories are and the basic shapes that stories take, both in our imagination and when we express them. And he says they're structured sequences of mental imagery. I think it's really important moving forward in this discussion to apply this definition to stories, because what it does is it doesn't limit our definition of stories to what they become after we express them. You know, a story is not a novel, a story is not a movie, a story is not any other form that they take in the physical world. First and foremost, a story is something that exists in our minds as a thing in and of itself. And that's really important. Because what that tells us is that stories are not strictly a product of our imagination, but they're actually a byproduct of how our brain works. So if we think and dream and communicate in structured sequences of mental imagery, something's going on there on a biological level that we don't really have any control over. And I think that's when we can start to talk about where do stories come from. Joseph Campbell has a really good quote that explains this. Joseph Campbell is a scholar of comparative mythology. And for anyone who studies mythology, mythology is kind of like the proto-story. Basically, every story we tell today, either in plot, structure, or influence, has its roots in some mythology from around the world. He says, myth comes from the same zone as dream, from the great biological ground, whatever it may be. They are energies and they are matters of consciousness. I really love that thought. That stories are products of biological evolution. That approximately 13.1 billion years ago, this process started called evolution. Well, actually the Big Bang, and then that led to this chain reaction that we'd already talked about with exploding stars and the formation of planets. And then on one of those planets, some of that matter started evolving into life, started taking on the characteristics of what we now call life. And after billions of years of that process, some of those naturally evolving organisms started telling stories. Like, what's that about? Like, what is that? Like, when you think of all the things that we do with stories, how we communicate with stories, it's really, I think, to me, it's really interesting to think about how every insignificant, ridiculous comedy bit, every outlandish movie, every great novel, I mean, whether you're talking about the ridiculous or the profound, imagine that coming from a plant, or imagine that coming from anywhere else but humans. It's natural in that really fundamental way, and I think that's important to realize. And I think what's really interesting about the evolutionary process, and when it comes to getting to our next question of why we tell stories, somewhere along the lines of that evolutionary process, we started to not just think and communicate, but we were aware of those thoughts. We developed self-awareness, which was a huge benefit to us, because not only were we beings that unthinkingly existed in an environment, but we were beings that were able to mentally step back from that process, look at our surroundings and go, how would this be better if I could, how could I make this better? So we became self-aware, and that was where we got this really great, gift, but also a bit of a burden. And with self-awareness comes existential crises. How easy is it for you to, as soon as you become self-aware, you have to go, okay, oh, interesting, I'm here. Why am I here? What am I doing with my life? What's my purpose? And so I can only imagine if you're in a constant battle for survival every day, like you get up and you're like, okay, I gotta get food today, I gotta hunt today, I gotta make sure, we have fire and warmth and all this stuff. That's like critical stuff. You can't afford to be bogged down by these philosophical questions of, oh no, where do I come from? Maybe I'll sit here and have a think while, a saber-toothed tiger eats me or something. So I think, and I apologize for not having the time in this format to go into, some of the studies that are behind this, but I can give you guys peeks at any of the books that I brought with me, where all these books right here are basically the source material for where this talk came from. But basically what ends up happening is stories become a way for us to deal with the burden of our biggest asset, which is our self-awareness. Okay. There are three critical functions, and in the introduction and on the bulletin, I even talked about this, the idea that, okay, let's say that stories are natural, they're part of the biological process of evolution, therefore they must have some key functions that they perform for us to aid in our survival. So if you start with the idea that we need to have some mediation of our self-awareness, some way to create a mental framework that we can live inside so we don't have to freak out about the big philosophical questions every day. We can just go about our lives. There are 3 things under that category that stories do for us. The first is they aid in individual psychological development. The second is they help everybody socially integrate and cooperate with each other, even if there's not some type of direct leadership going on. And then they also help us relate to the cosmos. And when I say the cosmos, I don't just mean like the stars and stuff like that. I mean something completely integrated. So I mean everything. So it's like our daily tasks, our neighbors, our greater society, our planet, and then our ideas of death and eternity. And I'm gonna hit each one of these in turn. Yeah, this is a good point I want to make sure I mention. So because of that, because of it doing stories accomplishing all of this for us, what we end up realizing is that perhaps the most impressive thing that stories do is that they provide us with the means of entertainment, creative expression, and these 3 things all at once. And it can do all of those things at once. So at any given time, one story or one set of stories can provide all of these functions and services for everyone in a given community all at the same time. So if everybody gathers around a fire, they hear the same story. Each person hears that story in their own personal context, and it does something for them where they're at. And so what it does is it ends up being just incredibly efficient and effective for all of these purposes for everyone all at the same time. So there's no other thing that gives us the same level of economy and cognitive time, effort, and energy. So the first one that I want to talk about, psychological development. In virtually every culture in the history of the world, stories we now know as fairy tales and folk tales were used to aid children in navigating the often confusing and frightening landscape of their developing minds. In his book, The Uses of Enchantment, child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim explains it this way. The fairy tale offers fantasy materials which suggest to the child in symbolic form what the battle to achieve self-realization is all about, and it guarantees a happy ending. So out of necessity, fairy tales are almost always optimistic, and they're unrealistic in terms of the outside world. This is intended to encourage the reader or listener of the tale to turn the information they learn through it inward and apply it to themselves. And that's an unconscious thing. It's not like kids are going, oh, I should apply that information to my life. Their fairy tales kind of like socially became what they are because they stayed effective throughout time. So, you know, in a society that is mostly spoken word, an oral society, they don't really have written word. Everybody's constantly reiterating or slightly changing or mixing up whatever story it is they're telling. And so the main points of fairy tales, which is they all developed in oral traditions, the ones that ended up sticking and getting passed down, or the main points that stayed, were always the ones that had this effect on children and performed these functions. Bettelheim continues in another quote here. It is characteristic of fairy tales to state an existential dilemma briefly and pointedly. This permits the child to come to grips with the problem in its most essential form, where a more complex plot point would confuse the matter for him. The fairy tale simplifies all situations. Its figures are clearly drawn, and details, unless very important, are eliminated. All characters are typical rather than unique. So what this does is it makes it really easy for children to project themselves onto the hero of the story, and in the confines of their own imagination, they're able to develop the skills and confidence that they need in order to grow into psychological maturity, which is a state that they'll need in order to be productive members of their group or society or tribe. Yeah, what's up?
I was just thinking about the Grimm's fairy tales. A lot of those have kind of bad endings.
Yeah.
But I don't know what percent of all fairy tales are Grimm's fairy tales. So.
Right, well each, from what I understand, I mean, I'm not a scholar of stories, but I study them pretty extensively. There are traditions like the 1,001 Nights, Arabian Nights, that's primarily Indian and Middle Eastern and partly Asian stories. The Brothers Grimm was all Germanic, and it spread throughout most of Europe. And then if you go back far enough, each big culture has their own network, and every tribal community ended up having their own network of either folk tales or fairy tales. What we now call fairy tales kind of gets its name from stuff like Brothers Grimm and some other collections, but folk tales are most of the time basically the same thing. And I'll talk more about how fairy tales, folk tales, and myth all get tangled up in a culture. So the second thing that I want to talk about is social integration and cooperation. So another type of story emerged as a means of aiding human beings to take that next big step in life, from childhood to their adult life, graduating from one role into another to help people claim their place in society. And that type of story is known as myth. So where fairy tales and folk tales are primarily optimistic, localized to psychological development within childhood and dealing with mundane, if still magical subject matter, such as visiting grandma, talking to a frog, or walking through the woods, myths tend to be more pessimistic, dealing with the hard facts of life, the responsibilities of adulthood, and the inevitabilities of death. So this is actually symbolized in... I'm really bad at keeping up with my slides. This is actually symbolized in a pattern known as the hero's journey. This was discovered and formulated by Joseph Campbell, who I mentioned earlier. This is my version of his famous hero's journey chart. And another interesting insight gained from, in part from Campbell's work, is how powerful the hero's journey and other narrative structures are in shaping the collective consciousness of a society. In essence, priming societies or groups of people for mass cooperation. So every cultural tradition has had, in the history of the world, has had some type of core set of stories that they all either believe in or at least familiar with. And these usually take the shape of a religious mythology. This religious mythology tends to inform the values and set the standards of normality for that culture, for everything from your life trajectory, gender roles, love, success, and virtually all other aspects of life. By accepting and believing in the same set of stories and essentially instilling a collected identity, or evolving into a collective identity with shared values, this does something really interesting for mobilization and cooperation in large groups. It allows subgroups and leaders within that larger collective to achieve, to manipulate those stories and the values represented in those stories to achieve certain goals. So on the positive side of things, you might have leaders or subgroups encouraging everyone to, hey, this is what, for instance, this might be familiar in our culture, even though it doesn't play out like this all the time in politics, but, if you believe in, what Jesus stood for, then you'll love thy neighbor, you'll feed the poor, and you'll stand up for the oppressed. We all know that doesn't always happen, but that kind of goes in on the other side. So you have a positive side of these are things that people can reference back to the values of a shared collection of stories in their culture and say, do this thing because, and then they tie back in. On the negative side, and I think we see this a lot, is you get, we all believe this value and they're a threat to it, so hate this minority group. Or let's go to war with this people, or let's wipe them off the face of the earth. I think as a sort of it's interesting, but it's also horrifying side note to this whole phenomenon, is that the values that live at the core of these stories, regardless of the desired goal, they almost never change. So in America, we got, we love God and country, therefore slavery. And in World War II, you got, we love God and country, therefore genocide and the Holocaust. You get the same values, seemingly positive values, and they're used to mobilize whole groups of people based on what are supposed to be deep religious or mythological traditions to do X. And X can be very good or it can be very bad. The third critical function that stories play in a culture and human beings' life, you might say survival advantage, is relating to the cosmos. So another key element of mythology, perhaps even its source of origin, is how it contextualizes the lives of those who embrace it within the greater cosmos, all the way down to their immediate surroundings and everyday lives. It is in this mode of thinking which the sort of wellspring of religious ritual comes out of. What we do is we end up using ritual as a means to weave mythology into the fabrics of our lives. So it's just a story, but hey, when we act out this symbolic thing, it becomes part of who we are and part of what makes our community special. So some examples of this are initiation rites, baptisms, seasonal festivals, planting rituals, harvesting rituals, weddings, and funerals, and that's just to name some of the really big ones. Ideally, there are three things that any local mythology will have done in the past for its people group. And that is, it will embody or represent the most advanced ideas about how the universe works. It will prescribe how society is supposed to work. And it'll give everyone in that picture an idea of exactly what their role is and where they're supposed to be. That way, at the end of the day, everybody, no matter if they're a king or a peasant, they're out there doing their thing and, they're just so fulfilled because digging this manure or planting this field is exactly what, they were put here to do. It gives everybody a sense of purpose and unity. And what it results in is this feeling of all of life in perfect harmony, or at least the illusion of it. In most cultures, the last time that this type of arrangement actually worked in the world, or at least in Western culture, was the Middle Ages in Europe. And the Roman Catholic mythology was something that it was very, nobody got any extra information. So for hundreds of years at least, any other opinion was suppressed. Nobody else was really coming in and telling another different, compelling story. And so for everybody who believed or didn't care to think outside that box, the Roman Catholic mythology did that for Europe, and it did its job actually pretty admirably insofar as it performed those functions. It's extremely problematic in a whole slew of other ways, which I'm sure this crowd's probably familiar with. Today, on the other hand, we don't really have any mythology that can do that for us. We live in what I like to call mythologically challenged times. Today, there's too many pesky facts and for simple stories to address, and for a story or for a collection of stories to do those things that I talked about, it has to be simple because people have to be able to pass it on without having a master's degree or being a scholar or knowing multiple languages. They have to go, here's a really simple idea that I learned from my mom and dad, and now I can pass it on to you. And you're 5 and you get it and you can tell your friends. And so it has to be really simple, but we live in a complex world now where people just know what's going on. They have an education, they have a scientific education. There's too many facts to sweep under the rug. You just end up having a rug on top of a pile. And there's also a lot of competing narratives. Everybody in every part of the world can tell their story or their version of a myth, and no one gets to say, mine's better than yours, at least for free thinkers, because if you're at least acknowledging everything that's out there, every story that everybody else is trying to tell, you're going to realize real quickly that none of them really get to be primary in your life. So let's see. I apologize if I'm going too slow here. So here's the thing about stories and how they function in society. And I think a lot of people start to wonder, okay, well, what's going on with, all the inconsistencies? How could people have ever gotten anything out of this stuff? Anybody who thinks a little bit is going to know that, even if they don't have scientific facts, there's contradictions all over the place. It does these collections of stories, whether they're fairy tales, myths, or mythologies, they don't really make a lot of sense. And I think one of the really interesting things about myths, fairy tales, and folk tales, they're not supposed to make sense. They were never supposed to make sense. They're only ever supposed to accomplish those key functions. And so the three main things that you really wanted to have were you wanted to have a body of culturally relevant literature that replaced the anxiety of existential dread with a sense of purpose, aided in the development of a personal and collective identity, and put all aspects of one's life in harmony with the cosmos. I'm really behind on these slides. Yeah. Today, instead of having a mythology that works for everybody, we have an economy that works for some people. And stories, by and large, are an economic endeavor. You know, people write books, they have a blog, they create movies, they create videos, and these stories are more or less there to generate cash that empower the rest of our lives. They don't really give us a lot of the same benefits as they did before. So what I wanted to close with is 3 different ways that we can kind of reclaim the benefits of storytelling without resorting to self-delusion or religious nonsense. And I think the first step is recognizing and practicing that self-awareness that we have to realize that our lives, whether we know it or not, or whether, you know, even in a given situation we're aware of it, they're constantly being mediated by stories. So if you find yourself being very emotionally reactive to a news story or a political narrative or something like that, it might be beneficial to stop and go, okay, how am I responding to facts here, or am I responding to stories here, like a narrative that's been strung together? Am I getting the full picture? So that's one example, but here are 3 things that we can do with that self-awareness to improve our lives and improve, hopefully, the lives of other people in our immediate surroundings. So the first is reclaim your personal identity. In your head right now, you have an idea about yourself. It's called your personal identity. This identity is a story you're telling yourself, and its plot points are the events of your life. So you could just imagine that each one of these dots represents an experience or an idea about yourself in your past. And by default, we all have an identity, which is basically just a connection, probably random, of different events in your past that you have mentally highlighted as, when you think of who am I, what makes me, me, you have a certain set of events that you trace back and you, oh yeah, I'm this guy or I'm that person. And what's unfortunate is that this story is not always true. I mean, all of these events happened, and some of these plot points might not be yours, though. Like, some of these plot points someone else might have written and forced them on you through religion, through cultural narrative, through bullying, or through abuse. And when we gain that self-awareness of, oh, you know, we think in stories. When I think about my past, I'm creating a narrative of who I am. You know, we can edit that narrative. We can decide, okay, is this story actually reflective of who I am, or is it reflective of what other people have told me who I am throughout my life? And so you might find that by identifying what some of these other plot points are in your past, you'd like to connect those dots differently and tell a different story about who you are. And what's cool about this when we do it is you might be living your life in a mode where you feel stuck, or you feel like, you know, you've kind of peaked, or you don't have a lot of options that excite you about who you are and what your future is. If you change these plot points all of a sudden without lying or deluding yourself, just choosing different identity markers in your past, all of a sudden you have not only a brand new past, but a brand new future and a lot of new opportunities and a lot of new things that you can explore. And it can really benefit your happiness and sense of well-being. The second thing is you can embrace and contribute to a scientific mythology. So just like I identified that dot graph as something that we can control for our personal lives and our personal narrative, science over the last 400 years has been making discoveries that are creating new plot points for the story of the universe, for the story of matter, stars and planets and life in general. And what we can do is, without lying, without creating fake stories or divine revelation, we can start to plot stories with that raw data and create narratives that are just as compelling as any other mythology out there. We just have to compete with a couple thousand years of perceived authority on their part. But I think if anything shows that science can win out, it's look at the world around you. You know, when it comes to heart surgery and transportation and manufacturing, are people asking how God would do it, or are they asking how engineers and scientists would do it? Eventually, I think all else will follow, and we can maybe help the culture along by embracing and contributing to a scientific mythology. Some of the symbols that we have, some of the raw plot points and archetypal images that we have to work with as elements of our stories include the Big Bang, the cosmic calendar, the fact that we are all stardust, and the biological tree of all life. Finally, and I know this is going to be a big hit with non-religious people, we're going to turn every story into our own personal holy scripture. And I don't mean that literally. I do have a metaphor that I like to explain why I say that, though. So imagine in your mind right now a jewel. It's huge. It's infinite in all directions, and these are the multifacets of that jewel. As you can see, it's so close that we can't even see the boundaries of it, and that's because it's just too big. At each point on this jewel is a life, is someone's story. It's a dream, it's a novel, it's a comic book. It's some form of a story that came from human beings. And the connections are what form it into the jewel of the human experience. What we can do is we can choose to explore those connections. We can probably never get to the point where we can objectively step back and say, I now know and understand what it means to be a human. But if we were able to see and hold and grasp that full jewel, we would know not only what it means to be human, we would know what it means to be alive, what it means to exist, and what the human experience is in its totality. But of course, there's not enough time or resources to explore that entire thing. And most of the stories that would make it up are in prehistory or were never given the chance to be told in the first place. But what's cool is that even if we decide to explore just the part of that really precious treasure that is available to us, it's enough. You know, it's enough to it's enough to challenge us. It's enough to expand our minds. I can speak personally about this. I don't want to promise it like a preacher would or something, but it's enough, I think, to heal mental and emotional wounds when you encounter a story of someone who's been through what you've been through and faced the challenges that you've faced, and you don't have to feel like you're doing it alone. That's got a lot of therapeutic power to it. And it's enough to pass on to future generations as a legacy and as a part of a greater humanist mythology. So, thank you.